All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session of cultivating emotional balance. And we thought we'd do something a little bit different today. I've brought on one of my co-trainers, a person who was in Thailand with me in 2011, Drew Wilson, who has his Master's of Science in Human Performance and Educational Psychology. And so we were kind of working together, picking apart some of these materials so we can try to present them back to you. So this session will be a little bit of a review. We'll have some time for practice and unpacking with some different examples. And we'll also pause throughout for each of you to spend some time kind of coming up and generating your own examples. So really glad to have Drew Wilson here with us today. And before we get into our materials, well, welcome, Drew. If you want to say hello, say just a little bit about your time on the CEB training and what you've done with the work so far.
So with my time, as Vanessa said, we met in Thailand way back in 2011, and my application has mostly been with kids. I've used some of this, what we learned there, as well as another program trying to help kids be more resilient with some of the situations that they get into. But yeah.
Great. Yeah. And as His Holiness says, if we could teach these peace skills to the youngest generation, we would be well set up for our future. So I'm glad
Planting
we're all
seeds.
planting seeds. Yeah. So glad we're all spending a little time on this today. And before we go into the material, we'll just spend a few moments, maybe about 5 minutes, settling and practicing different any style of meditation that maybe you've practiced in the past. We have some to choose from if you're taking the full CEB course. So shamatha, mindfulness of breathing at the abdomen, or just focusing on the full body, or coming up to notice the sensations of breath entering and exiting at the nostrils. So I'll set our timer for 5 minutes. We'll spend some time settling. Start by taking a few long, slow, deep breaths, just allowing the awareness to come to rest in this moment. Just spend a few moments checking in, noting, checking in, releasing any tension that may be present. And when you're ready, shift your awareness to the sensations of the breath, entering and exiting the body. Remember, in these practices, we're just allowing the breath to be loose and relaxed, not trying to change or control it in any way. And in this practice, we're settling body, speech, and mind in their natural states, fully at ease, restful, serviceable. And let's bring this session to a close. All right. Well done, everyone. And remember, you can return back to that simple practice, just seasoning throughout the day, a few moments of peace and focus. And from here, we'll turn it over to Drew to kind of unpack that emotional episode timeline that we've been introduced to, but we'll kind of be seeing that throughout the course, applying different types of emotions and examples, just to really kind of make that more digestible. And in that way, we can also build that awareness as we move through our days and encounter triggers or emotional episodes. So I'll turn that over to Drew.
All right. So, yeah, we're just going to quickly go over a timeline of an emotional event. And what we'll do is we'll start off with what we'll call the precondition. And essentially, the precondition is just how you are before the emotional event. Have you had a good day, a bad day? What state you're in. And this can kind of prime what happens next. And say what happens next is someone spills some milk on you, and you can probably get angry. But before you get angry, what happens here is you have the event itself, and then you have your database, which I believe is called the emotional alert database. I think there are a couple of names for it. And when these two come together, essentially the event and the information you have from the past, things that have happened before, maybe scripts that have been there since you were a child. These two things come together and form your trigger. So a trigger isn't so much just an independent thing. It's an event and how you appraise the event that come together to form that trigger. Then you have the actual state. So now you're upset. In this case, I would say you're angry. From here, you have physiological changes. So for example, your heart rate will increase, you'll start breathing heavier, and you have psychological changes. So maybe depending on what's happened, you may have some thoughts about the person or just things surrounding it that kind of come along with it. Now, what also comes along with this are these sort of emotional blinders where you've put on these glasses that cause everything that happen or that filter out everything that does not kind of fit the narrative of how you're thinking and feeling at that moment. So, if you're angry at this person, they're like, man, this person always does stuff like that. And you kind of go down this pathway. But then also, if someone tries to tell you something that is against it, you just don't even hear it. You kind of shut it off. So that happens in there as well. Now, following this, you have either your constructive or your destructive actions. I'll start with the destructive. The destructive would be simply, yelling at this person, maybe breaking something, throwing a tantrum, anything that you might regret later. And your constructive, which might be something like if you've gone through trainings like this and you have more emotional regulation, being able to add something positive to the situation. Vanessa, do you have like another example for that?
Right. Yeah. And you think about, what would be constructive in that moment is probably maybe not responding in anger, but helping to clean up, or even pouring the person another glass of milk, depending on their age and ability. Maybe it's an older person or a younger person that could really use some help in that moment. Or at the very least, not causing that destructive action, going to clean yourself up or removing yourself. So there's probably even something in between, right? The positive and negative, or a neutral type of activity. Yeah, great.
And then last, you have the post condition. So, opposite of the precondition, this is essentially, the fallout. It's kind of what happens afterwards. And it can include things like the effect you've had on other people, and not just how you feel personally at that time. Now, what can happen from this is depending on what happens here, may lead to another precondition. So you've had this reaction where, let's say you had some destructive behaviors and you yelled at this person, and you're yelling at this person caused them to get angry in turn. And, this cycle starts all over again. It starts feeding back on itself. So that's basically the timeline in a nutshell. Now, what I would like for you to do is come up with an example of a time where you got angry and where you maybe got sad. So 2 different examples, and go through this chart and kind of see if you can label those instances, see if you can identify it. So hit pause and come back after you've had those 2 examples. Welcome back. I hope that worked out for you. Now we're going to move on and talk about emotional balance itself. So emotional balance is, so essentially you need to be aware of yours and other people's emotional behaviors, yours and others' emotional experiences, and yours and others' emotional triggers. And this isn't just overnight. This takes time. Now, keeping these things in mind when an emotional event takes place, you have to sort of balance this to make wise decisions or wise choices in how you respond. Kind of going back to our previous example, that would be like, constructive rather than destructive behaviors. And again, it takes practice, it takes time. This isn't something that you just, take a pill, for example, and everything's fine. It takes a lot of work. Right, so just like we did last time, I would like for you to take a moment and see if you can recall what I just talked about. and apply that to your previous example. Welcome back again. The journey. So we're going to start out with metacognitive awareness. And metacognitive awareness is basically thinking about your thoughts or being aware of your thoughts. Now, sometimes you may be sitting there at home and just, something will pop into your head. It's just a thought. Nothing has happened in your environment. But all of a sudden, maybe it's a time where someone did something to you that upset you. And, you sit there and you start ruminating and you get really caught up in these emotions that, nothing has happened. It's just a mental event. And being aware of this is essential, with also, being able to help regulate yourself, is to not get caught up in these mental events as they unfold on a day-to-day basis. So metacognitive awareness, kind of aware of your thoughts.
Right. And if you think of metacognitive awareness is really what enables the next piece that Drew's going to be talking about of, this emotional awareness, emotional balance could not really happen without a strong capacity for metacognitive awareness. So that's part of what we're building when we do those meditation practices, is actually finding out moment by moment and monitoring through a process of introspection, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. It's just kind of the ability to really monitor what's happening with us, right? And so that also then can contribute to being able to make those more constructive choices or more wise choices in a moment. If you're thinking, you have that awareness of, oh, this reminds me of, something that I had seen before and I got upset at that point. So we have this wonderful capacity as humans to remember past events, imagine future events, and also to maintain that metacognitive awareness in the moment. So
do you want to take this one too?
Yeah, well, so I mean, these are all kind of interrelated, and as you strengthen one capacity, you strengthen another capacity. So just, when we talk about emotional awareness, it actually can be sort of unpacking that timeline in real time, which actually sounds, maybe it sounds far-fetched, like, how could that happen? It goes from spark to flame, right? And but actually we can build, if you're monitoring your emotional state, your physical state, right? So that's something that we do learn in childhood when you're hungry or you need to use the restroom. But, I think we also have different parts of our lives as adults where we kind of stay cut off from those physical and physiological needs. So even by building awareness at that piece, so you can think of this like we could insert emotional awareness at any piece of that timeline, and that would change the course of the events, toward more of that wholesome activity that we're hoping for, more constructive relationships. And I guess one key piece of this is going back to where we began the course, which is, what is our true desire in this world? What's our intention? And then how do we kind of carry that out moment by moment?
So the spark, similar to our example, awareness comes in here too, is kind of being aware of, over time, what's in your emotional alert database, what gives rise to certain reactions. And like I said earlier, this takes time. This isn't overnight. But just think about the benefits in your life and in other people's lives when you start becoming more aware of these things that bring about that spark, and being able to regulate yourself with that awareness. And I guess, speaking of regulation, So emotional regulation, here we have a wave and sort of a caution symbol. And basically what I want that to represent is, these waves of emotions may come over you, and having the ability to not really react to them, to not get caught up in them, to not get carried away, pulled out to sea with these emotions. And that's giving yourself choice as to how you would react, rather than just reacting or going on like an automatic response.
Yeah, so just to kind of piggyback on the emotion regulation side of things, it's sort of it can be a challenging concept, right? So we've talked about even using the language of, is an emotion that we're expressing appropriate to the context or inappropriate? And sometimes emotion regulation, we can think of it as kind of I don't want you to falsely think of it as stuffing emotion or not expressing something that comes up. So that's kind of the basis behind cultivating emotional balance, is that we are creating that choice, right? And that maybe we do become aware of an emotion, and anger might be an appropriate expression, or it might be an appropriate emotion in some instances, but then we also have a choice in how to express that. Maybe we express it through writing a letter that we're not going to share with the, who might be the target of the perceived target of our anger. So that's a different way of expressing it. So it's never saying that the emotion itself is not appropriate, but then thinking about what might be a good way to work with this, right, to regulate. And the spark concept is definitely, we all kind of, most of us grew up in the States, know Smokey the Bear, right? Only you can prevent forest fires. And that's so true in this emotional domain too, right? So if you really take seriously this building of your emotional awareness, your metacognitive awareness, then you can become aware when that little spark of somebody said something, I don't think I'm really angry with them. I think I got triggered or reminded of a past painful episode or episode that caused anger that I wasn't able to express at that time. So then you can kind of work with the whole bandwidth, rather than just really truly believing that that trigger is something that should be really taken seriously and reacted to. So if we can kind of stamp out the spark or contain the spark, right? Because there might be some useful information in that, whatever it is, whether it's sadness or anger, fear, and just kind of understand, what's coming out of this. Then we have, more chance to have a constructive expression of that emotion.
Yeah, and again, this is I mentioned earlier that I work a lot with kids, and I tell them all the time exactly. There's nothing wrong with getting angry. There is nothing wrong with getting sad. Everyone experiences anger. Everyone experiences sadness, but it's kind of what you do in that moment. And the thing about these sparks is some things you may always struggle with events that are in your emotional or database, but that reaction that you were talking about is being able to make that choice in that moment. And I believe you wanted to talk about empathy and compassion.
Yeah, so this is a natural kind of segue. We know cultivating emotional balance really brings together the psychological wisdom with the contemplative wisdom, and sees the strength of both of those approaches. So there can be instances, right, and this can get into some hairy topics about, what about the forgiving the unforgivable, or these truly horrendous events that happen, and where does compassion factor in there? Or maybe we do need to express some type of wrathful anger. And I know that's a big question, for any person trying to live on a spiritual basis, or even just not cause a lot of damage, right, to our own physiology too, because that's the piece, the many of us have probably heard this quote that anger is like holding a hot coal and expecting our enemy to suffer, right? But who's the one suffering? And if we can release that, then we can start to release some of that suffering that I think many of us um, it's one of the axioms of psychology that humans are more or less trying to avoid pain and seek some level of comfort and pleasure. And of course, CEB moves us a little bit more toward what would be a lasting happiness. So empathy, of course, is just kind of being able to put yourself into someone else's shoes. And we have in the medical field what was called, they're calling it compassion fatigue, which I think is a misnomer, but I won't go all the way into that. But basically the difference between the two things that are on the slide here, empathy versus compassion. Compassion, we can kind of hold our own seat, but have a genuine desire for someone else to be free of their suffering, and also the causes of their suffering. So that's where this kind of wisdom comes in, is seeing, what is preceding any type of suffering that may exist. So story here that kind of relates to that emotional timeline, more of a parable. So put yourself in these shoes. You're we all have 1,000 things to do in a day and only so many hours. And so you finally get time to go to the grocery store, and you're carrying all your bags, up the stairs to your building, ready to, feed your family a nice meal. And somebody bumps into you and you drop all your groceries. And your first instance is, oh my gosh, right. And then you turn to the person and you see that they're using a cane and that they're actually blind. And so what happens in that next moment? Do you really stay angry, or do you start to understand, right, that they were unable to see you? And so, this damage that was caused was out of unawareness. So we can bring that same, hopefully, heartfulness into our interactions, right? So if somebody does cause harm, or say we cause a harm, or we don't catch that spark when it's just a spark and it turns into a flame, and we express anger or frustration, can we have some understanding, some compassion that came out of not having a better tool in that moment? So compassion is really seeing ourselves with that understanding, with that patience, and then seeing others with that same understanding and patience, followed by, right, it doesn't continue to excuse unexcusable behavior. It's followed by a sincere desire for the freedom from that harmful way of being. And some of that can be misunderstanding, right? So people that are seeking only material gain, the harm that can be caused by that way of interacting with the world, or folks who, I guess, just haven't had that exposure or ability to interact in a particular constructive way. So we can bring some compassion. So in a following recording, we will do a complete compassion practice, which starts to view ourselves, of course, as being free of suffering and the causes of suffering, and then also extending that out even toward people who we may have perceived as challenging in some past circumstances, and really wishing for them to be free of suffering as well. So we will engage in that practice as well. It's really supportive of the breath awareness practices, the shamatha, for training our focus. And then we balance that with those qualities of loving kindness and compassion that we've talked about and will continue to explore.
So we'd like you to do now is just kind of go through these on your own. Take a couple of minutes and see if you can sort of describe each of these to yourself. And if you need to rewind a little bit, that's fine. But just before you do it, just see what can you remember from these, and maybe again think about maybe how an example from your life. when this has come into play. Can't hear you.
I hope you all enjoyed that reflection, and you can kind of see how each of the pieces can work together, and how we can work at each of the levels, right, to have a more supportive environment toward, I guess, the life that would be, truly satisfactory, right, and filled with less suffering and better relationships with our fellows. And another just piece of, right, to truly train our minds, one of the precursors for that would be having few desires, right? So we have such a rich milieu of information sensory objects in our modern society, and some of them have enhanced our lives and quality of lives in so many ways, but we also have this overburdening almost of choices. And we have some research that comes out of positive psychology, Barry Schwartz, the paradox of choice, right? So you think if you have 100 different types of peanut butter to choose from, that's great because you have all these choices, but it can actually lead to dissatisfaction, because we might always be thinking, oh man, what if it was really that other peanut butter that was really going to make my day. So it just kind of overwhelms the senses and the psyche. So just reducing, kind of our threshold for the desires that we have. And I also kind of bring in expectations here, right? Because expectations can really rob us of some type of serenity in the moment when we're expecting someone to show up differently than they are, or when we're having an expectation of ourselves to show up differently than we are. So, just pointing the way back toward that genuine well-being that we talked about, that comes from what we bring to the world rather than what we can get from the world, right? Because the more we're focused on just staying comfortable, having our own needs met, the less we're really kind of seeing our interdependence with the rest of the system. And the more kind of areas for dissatisfaction there might be, versus kind of having more of that focus on the genuine well-being, contentment. And then, releasing anger as we develop that wisdom of realizing, I don't want to holding that hot coal. The more you can investigate, what does that feel like? And last time we practiced making the face, and we saw kind of what emotions and even what thoughts went along with just even making that face. It wasn't connected to any true episode, but even in just making that face, for me, I had a thought of how could this be, right? And it was just that way of holding and kind of suffering because it was rejecting what is. And in that case it was actually just physiology, but think of ways that we might relate to our world in that way. So if we can just start to release the anger or see what's there, to be kind of extracted and understood from it, and then bringing in compassion of whoever or whatever we might be angry at, kind of seeing the causes and conditions that may have come together to create that particular circumstance. And in that way, it's you kind of get to the wisdom of is there really, there's no one to point to in some ways. And again, this is really complex topic, so it doesn't mean that we don't hold people accountable, and we do have these laws in our society, and those are all important pieces of having a functioning system. But we can also practice compassion with that and think about our justice system. Maybe there's a space for compassion in there and rehabilitation. So anything that you wanted to add on this one, Drew?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. And then we wanted to just unpack one more broad topic, right? That it will continue to be introduced throughout the course, but usually when we think of meditation, mindfulness kind of enters the conversation too. And we've talked about how mindfulness can kind of be used in different ways that may or may not kind of hit to the heart of what we mean mindfulness in this context. So a quote from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, in my view, the most important meaning of mindfulness is recollection. In other words, mindfulness is the ability to gather oneself mentally and thereby recall one's core values and motivation. It suggests bringing presence of mind into everyday activities. So, really key point there of not just being aware of what you're doing while you're doing it, which is an important component of mindfulness, but then also carrying through that thread what we call prospective awareness. So we talked about setting intentions, right? So setting an intention to bring awareness into my daily activities. Or you can even do it in shorter bursts. I just watched a documentary with Gar Rinpoche, and he said his father would tell him to just select a rock a few hundred yards ahead and just set an intention to remain mindful until he reached that next rock. So we can kind of build in those little scaffolds into our day of, every time you open a door or sit down in a chair, you can try to remember, what is your intention and what's your purpose in showing up in your day. So important pieces here of remembering and recalling. So remembering to remember, and then recalling our intention and our core values, right? And Drew came up with a nice way of putting this together, which is remindfulness. So if you like that, feel free to use it and give him a shout out. So, right, it's not, I think there can be some different definitions, but the way that I find most useful is, right, building attention, staying focused on, our chosen object. So if we are in an active meditation practice, then that chosen object would be sensations of breath or perhaps compassion, whatever practice we're doing at the time. But when we're, as we say, off the cushion, right, out in the world, living our engaged way of life, we can also keep practicing bringing awareness and just kind of moving and speaking in ways that are more helpful and soothing to others. And this is also part of our yoga practice as well, right? To speak in soothing ways and to move in ways that are respectful of ourselves and others and our world.
And I wanted to touch briefly on what you said a minute ago about our beliefs and what we know or what we feel is important to us, and kind of remembering to remember these things. I mean, and if you think about something like cognitive dissonance, right, it's behaving in ways that you believe is kind of the opposite of, or behaving in ways that are the opposite of what you believe. And kind of that's the same thing here, is as you go through your day-to-day activities, when you're interacting with people, what is important to you, keeping that in mind and remembering to remember that. So.
Great. And then just another kind of quality that's supportive of this room mindfulness, and it can also move us back to compassion or back to the qualities that we are trying to cultivate, would be introspection. So Drew and I were kind of going and thinking, well, it's quite similar to metacognitive awareness in some ways. So I think of it kind of like a particular case of metacognitive awareness. So introspection is just that moment by moment awareness that's used to monitor our physical state and our mental state. So remember I mentioned, right, even knowing, hey, I haven't had a drink of water in a while, or starting to get hungry. And if we don't have that introspection, right, then we might just kind of go to just notice the cognitions and, the thoughts, and start to believe that everyone around us really is true and lasting jerk, and then just forget, hey, why don't I have a sandwich and see how I feel, right? So having that quality, and it also takes on a special form when we are meditating, right? So being able to know, am I still focused on the object? Have I gotten drawn away? We also can call this being hijacked by an emotion. So that can happen right in our practice, even just kind of self-generated thoughts. And then if you don't notice those as they come up, you can be drawn off. But the goal is really to be monitoring. So throughout our practice and throughout our day, just to note, what's going on internally and externally. Okay, and then once we go through this journey, which of course we know will be very ongoing, and little bitty pieces of progress and little wedges of awareness and mindfulness, then we get to this. The way we react emotionally to any given situation depends to a large extent on our own outlook, our own attitude, and our own emotional habits. It's a quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and we can really look at each of those, right? What is our outlook? Are we expecting good things to happen? Or maybe we're already kind of engaging in a self-defeating or pessimistic attitude. And that can also go back to that selective filtering or that confirmation bias. And that's also why it's so important just to maintain a moment by moment awareness, because even if we've just gone through an emotional episode, there's always, each moment offers a new ability to recover, right? And to move into a new state. And then, each of those states over time leads to an emotional trait, right? A habit of how we interact, the types of expectations that we have for ourselves and others. So CEB really offers that opportunity, right? If we commit first, if we find value in these practices, and then we commit to really making it a practice and a way of life, then hopefully you will see the benefits of that. All right, and we have our Chinese proverb encouraging us, which sounds somewhat challenging too. If you're patient in one moment of anger, you will escape 100 days of sorrow. So see if that's true for you. And our challenge to you, our invitation to you throughout maybe the next week or even the next month until we come back, is to really start to track these things for yourself, so you can do a formal emotion episode diary if you're taking the course. But even if you're not, just take maybe that timeline, and if you have a situation that arises, you can kind of unpack it and say, oh, well, how was I feeling before I had that challenging interaction with my boss or my coworker, or my partner, or my dog, right? Or myself. So any of those things, and you can kind of just maybe take a look at each piece of the timeline and see, maybe in a future instance, you could even envision yourself behaving a little bit differently, or maybe taking, more care in the beginning of the day, to give yourself a leg up on that precondition, so that as things, come through our perceptual filters throughout the day, we can meet that with a little bit more resilience and patience. So I want to thank you all for joining us for this exploration. Drew, it was wonderful to have your input and insights. And any final concluding thoughts?
No, I just want to say, I guess, good luck. It's when you start tracking your kind of your emotional database in these things, it's really interesting to see kind of to have awareness of, what automatic thoughts you may have. And also you start learning some of your biases as well. So, this is all really important to understand.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it is possible, and it is worthwhile. And we always say simple, but not easy. So keep practicing, and we'll see you next time.